Welcome to December 2020's question and answer. I'm actually doing another training, and this is kind of an excerpt from it. And the reason I chose it is because a lot of times when I'm talking, particularly to therapists or people that are trying to help folks, regardless of whether it's trauma or something else, how often they are using symptoms of behavior to justify that there's a person that is damaged, there's a person who's mentally ill, here their bad behavior. And it makes it difficult because when you conceptualize something as, for example, it's bad behavior, what you're really doing is creating a whole sequence of thought about and that sequence of thought has a value or a judgment about what that behavior is and what it means. So I want to run through this really quickly and see if I can help people look at things a little differently, and kind of justify some of the science behind why I'm suggesting that we need to look at it differently. So again, anytime during this, if you want to ask Zach a question, what I'll do at the end of this sequence is then answer those. But otherwise, I'm just going to go ahead and go for this. We have some people online that are watching, and I don't want to deprive them of being able to get something of value from our time together. So single event traumas, in other words, the rest of your life is in pretty good shape and you've had something bad happen to you, it is pretty awful. But most people are going to work through that without ever seeking therapists. Most people that have an optimal kind of good support system don't have a lot of history of stress or a lot of trauma in their histories, and something happens, they're going to work through it with the support of their secure attachments. And if they do need to come in for therapy, therapy will go pretty quickly. That's great. Makes us as therapists feel really good when we have that kind of a client because, in a few sessions we see so much change and we feel really good about ourselves and what good therapists we are. But what we see the most of in clinical practice is not the single event traumas. And what we see there is people that have histories of complex trauma. And so the question then becomes, where does complex trauma come from? And so the simple answers are I'm going to kind of cover these three for you. The first is that there's a demand placed upon the physiology of the body that surpasses our ability to cope, be resilient, or is impairing our function. And that demand has started sometime in our history and gone for a prolonged period of time or is currently still in place. And that is creating a complex trauma situation. I want you to really understand that you don't need a single event of any kind or even a series of bad events to create a complex trauma. All you need is to have the body stressed enough that it surpasses its ability to cope or be resilient. Complex trauma is usually related to being in distressing environments. It's not about an impairment in the person, it's about a distressing environment. We'll talk more about that in a minute. It's also a lack of adequate attachment and secure relationships that can help calm and relax the nervous system. So when you start having these three things kind of emerge simultaneously, you have the perfect storm for a complex trauma to emerge. So when we have a complex trauma, let's talk about the environments that are triggering it. Again, these are not big bad events. These are small repeated events or situations that together have a cumulative harm effect. So what we're looking at is any chaotic environment that people are raised in or are currently living in is generating stress responses or overwhelming reactions. If you have it happening day after day, hour after hour, week after week, month after month, that chaos is going to overwhelm our ability to keep ourselves regulated. It's going to overwhelm our body's system of being able to bring our nervous system back into balance, and complex trauma is going to emerge out of that. If we're living in environments, either growing up or currently, that were aggressive environments, we're going to see the same kind of response, where the body's system of being able to cope, to be resilient, and our functioning gets impaired. We have the punitive environments, where there is a tremendous demand for performance and a lot of judgment, shame, criticism when performance isn't measured, or the environment is one that uses a lot of punitive measures to gain compliance and acquiescence. This would be where somebody uses intimidation to control. This is where somebody would use name calling and sarcasm and put downs in order to maintain control. A punitive environment. When there's any kind of inconsistencies in the practices of the environment, in a working organization where the policies and procedures don't agree with the common practice, that's an inconsistent practice. If it's in the walls of your own home and the parents are not abiding by the same rules and criteria that they demand of children, that's an inconsistent practice. So, and in the United States at least, inconsistent practices in homes is huge, because so much of the parenting that's done is based on the annoyance factor. You get in trouble for annoying a parent, whether there's a rule or not. The rule then becomes, you better pay attention to the attitude and mood of the parent, because that is the ultimate rule maker. Is if you annoy a parent, then you're in trouble. That is a horrible practice that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on children. It forces them to be hyper vigilant. It forces them to not pay attention to their own systems, but have to pay attention to dysregulated adults in their environment. And then finally, instability. This can be instability of residence, instability of economics. It can be any kind of instability. So any one of these is enough to create trauma symptoms in the lives of the persons that live in these environments, or the persons that are in and out of these environments. When you start adding them, the exponential force of having multiples of these in any environment is a cumulative harm effect that is the foundation of complex trauma. So a lot of times people, particularly if you're familiar with the ACE studies, there are certain things that are acts of commission: sexual abuse, physical abuse, and neglect, emotional abuse and neglect, physical assault, sexual assault, are all things that are active, overt things that are done, and they're very distressing to the child's developing body. But most everything else is based on family dysfunction. And if we wanted to use these criteria, family dysfunction is the environment's chaotic, it's aggressive, it's punitive, it's inconsistent, and it's unstable. Well, that's a horrific recipe for children. If you have a work environment that is chaotic and aggressive and punitive and inconsistent and unstable, then you have stress in that environment. And I think a lot of times in mental health clinics, the way the leadership of those clinics operates is actually creating these 5 bad environments. And you know that when you look at the numbers of turnover. When you have as an industry, there's about a 20% turnover rate per year of clinical staff. When you start exceeding that significantly, that isn't a problem with counselors. It isn't a problem with hiring practices. It is a problem with the leadership of that organization having not actively creating environments that are free of chaos, aggression, punitiveness, and that are very consistent, very routine, very predictable, and that they are not unstable. And that's really kind of difficult to find. One of the things that has been interesting in working with organizations is how often the therapists, when they do measures of these in their own environment and their work environment, score higher than clients quite often. So, that explains in some part, as it shares in it, when you start having companies that have 50, 60, 70% turnover rate of their clinical staff, you are not dealing with the problems of the therapist. You are dealing with an organization that can't create environments that lack this kind of these features. They're chaotic, aggressive, punitive, inconsistent, and unstable. If you think about this on a massive scale, cultures that are like this tend to have problems and increasing numbers of problems of a social nature. This isn't just, human beings are not designed to be able to tolerate a constant state of chaos, aggression, punitiveness, inconsistency, and instability, and prosper. This is one of the primary features of complex trauma. Now, before I go this, I'm going to move into the dopamine cycles here in a second and why that's important to pay attention to. But the way people learn to respond to these environments become habituated patterns. They become kind of automatic responses, and they become kind of almost embedded in the nervous system of the people that have had these experiences or are having these experiences. And the natural consequence of these is that we take some action to either control this or minimize it. And so whichever action we take is going to lead to some kind of reinforcement. So if we look at dopamine, which we already know is tied to motivation and goal-seeking behavior, when somebody is moving toward, which is they're taking charge, they're actively adapting, they're really trying to get control. They can be kind of aggressive or hostile, and often they're using a movement toward process. If your client is grown up or currently lives in this chaotic, aggressive, punitive, inconsistent, or unstable environment, how do they move towards these environments? So let me give you kind of a thought process behind this. Remember that we're generating dopamine cascades with this behavior. So if I am a person that moves towards, I may become aggressive when I'm in one of these environments. It's not only I've got to get my way, I've got to be safe. So let me give you an easy example. There's a lot of chaos around, and you are worried about your job because it seems like the environment is kind of unstable, and that you've had 5 managers in the last 11 months, and so you see a lot of inconsistencies. And so how much are you on alert? So you get a new employee, and it looks like the new employee is getting pretty tight with your new supervisor, and you don't want to be put in a position where you are looked at badly because they have this buddy relationship that's developing, and so you sabotage your coworker, or you get territorial, or you don't share information, or you become protective of what you know that they don't know. That's a recipe for real problems in an organization, but it's predictable that it would happen because the environment is so arousing, and the environment is so distressing, and you're adapting to that by moving towards some action. Or you may engage in arguments, or you may engage in name calling or put down because you are trying to gain control in an environment that is out of control. And so, if that makes any sense to you, every time you act in a way to gain control, you get a discharge of dopamine, a little micro release of dopamine, what we call a dopamine cascade. And that means that you're more likely to do this behavior again. And most of what we see reinforced over and over again is those dopamine cascades. So we have this moving towards behavior that can be pretty hostile, pretty sabotaging, and it's actively done. And people say, well, why would they do that? Because taking that action gets them a dopamine release, and that's reinforcing, it's motivating. Now, what about the other side? When you are moving away from, if your client has grown up or currently lives in chaos, aggression, punitiveness, inconsistency, or an unstable environment, how do they move away from that? So let's go back to that same example. So this new employee has come in and they are looking like they're going to be buddy with the new boss, and you might seriously be impacted by that. What do? You shut down. You try to be invisible. You try not to draw attention to yourself. That's a moving away behavior or a mitigating behavior. And when you do those things, just the act of doing them is going to release a dopamine cascade. So understanding that regardless of whether you're moving toward or you're moving away from or you're moving towards something, each of those strategies get reinforced with a dopamine release. And when you develop habits of behavior where you've done something many, many times and you've built a neural pathway around it, those neural pathways are maintained by these dopamine releases, and we're motivated to engage in that behavior. So people with complex trauma histories often have kind of unusual processes around how they see the world and how they react to the world. And a lot of times in the mental health or the self-help or in sales organizations or in any organization that uses kind of that moving towards, you want this, you get this is your thing, man, go after this thing, this is wonderful. You're going to find people with complex trauma are going to struggle with that sometimes because all of their dopamine reinforcement is from avoiding things. And if you really want to help them, you have to help them avoid in a way that moves them forward. And they don't really train that very well in most educational settings. And it's not something that's generally thought of in most therapy settings. So what kinds of patterns would be built when people are raised in these or living in these cumulative harm environments? Again, the cumulative harm environment is one that is chaotic, aggressive, punitive, inconsistent, and unstable. If a human being is living in one of those, living in that combination of environments, one or all of them or some of them, there is typical belief systems and typical responses that emerge. These are not mental illness. They are not bad behavior. They are not evidence of symptomology of pathology. They are simply biologically correct responses to being in this area of multiple environments that are harmful. And sometimes this becomes intergenerational. I have worked with a number of families that have a high use of sarcasm, name calling, and put down, and they think it's funny, but they're having problems in their family and it's affecting their connection and attachment to each other because that's how the parents feel in control, or that's how the older siblings feel like they have some control in a chaotic environment. That is not a problem. That is not a problem that's centered in the mental illness of somebody. It is not a problem centered into the good-heartedness of somebody. It's a problem that is housed in the environment. And the change that occurs needs to be in the environment, not in the person. Let me give you a different look at this. You cannot take a child in an environment and expect that they will outperform the parameters of the chaos or the environment that they're in. They tend to be built, as all human beings are built, to respond to the environment. And if we are in an environment that is constantly stressing this body, we are going to develop procedural memory or implicit memory or habit of how to respond to those environments. And this is, I'm going to go through a couple of screens of these kinds of typical, completely biologically correct responses. And I want you to understand this is not evidence of mental illness. This is evidence that people are living in chaos or punitiveness, or they're living in these cumulative harm environments, and either they have in their history or they currently are living in those environments. And these are the patterns that grew in that maturity process, or they're patterns that are growing in the environments that they're in now. So let's just do a real quick look at some of these. So one of the things that you will see, particularly if people had these cumulative harm environments early in life, you're going to see that they have developed some fear of trusting people, yet they have a desire to trust people. They're often lonely. Even in crowds of people, they feel lonely and isolated. They're going to have difficulty regulating their emotions. They're going to have a lot of memory and emotional flashbacks. They're going to be hypervigilant quite often. They're not going to have a lot of hope or faith that things can ever improve or be different, and it's going to be difficult for them to have hope that anything will help the situation. They have a lot of unmet needs that are driving a lot of behavior. They feel often a lot of intense shame, self-blame. They, feel an overwhelming sense of or a lack of personal worthiness. They often are dissociated quite significantly, and they have a lot of non-specific anxiety, just anxiety that's general. It's not focused on any specific reason. Again, we often use these symptoms to say someone has an illness, or we label them in some way. And the reality is that if you want to work on these, you don't focus on the loneliness. You focus on how do we change the environment so that that environment isn't chaotic, aggressive, punitive, unpredictable, and unstable. How do we change that in those environments? If we want these things to change, we have to change the environment. And that's one of the challenges of complex trauma, because it takes what we've done in the mental health world. We've made the problem some kind of emotional, cognitive, behavioral problem that is housed within the person. There's some deficit in here that is causing that behavior. The reality is not true. That is not true. That is not true. What we have is a very sensitive system that responds to the environment. And if the environment is toxic, which is those cumulative harm environments are toxic, if the environment is toxic, these are the naturally occurring responses, and this isn't all of them, but these are some of the naturally occurring consequences of living in those environments. That isn't a deficit in the person. That's a deficit in the environment. And it's amazing how people don't want to deal with that. It's so much more comfortable to say, well, the problem is this employee, not this environment. The problem is this child, not the parental structure. The problem is my partner or my spouse, rather than it's the environment that we create together. And so we really need to do a different way of looking at these things. Another group of these that are early procedural habits that emerge out of being in these cumulative harm environments are that often we are seen by others as being difficult to be around. We tend to doubt information and want concrete proof that something is really true. We tend to be guarded in most social situations. If this is your background and you have grown up in toxic stress environments, these cumulative harm environments, these are not odd things for you to experience. Mistrustful of others, harsh when provoked. When a little bit of response to a do, you tend to over-respond. You use praise to control others, not to genuinely point out the good points of them. You prefer your own company in large amounts of the time. You love personal time and need a lot of it. People that have that kind of cumulative harm environment response, a lot of times they need to be someplace where they can be separate from those environments in order to calm down, and they tend to get reinforced from doing that. They tend to paint themselves as victims. They tend to be aloof and rarely volunteer information about themselves. When they are asked, they feel like somebody's probing, invading, and that information, if they give it, is going to be used against them. That disclosures, if I ever share anything with somebody, it's going to come back to haunt me. Very emotional, but tend to not express those emotions very much. Either they can't control them at all, or they tend to really govern them down because they've learned that being emotional is going to get you nowhere. Has few friends and rarely discloses or shares much with those friends. It doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of acquaintances, but there's very few people that actually know what's going on in them at any one time or another. They may be really good at finding out what other people are doing and feeling, but they may not ever really share much of that with anybody else. And they tend to be self-focused, often do not look at what is going on around them because they are so tied up with trying to deal with the arousal that they're experiencing. So these are common, predictable kinds of responses that emerge when people are raised in toxic stress environments or those cumulative harm environments. What I'm suggesting to you is, rather than see these things as the problem, see them as symptoms of a system that is overwhelmed, and start asking yourself, what do I need to do to help this individual, this family, this group, this business, this community change the environment, reduce the chaos, increase the compassion and the connectedness to each other. In other words, reduce aggression, reduce punitiveness. How do I make an environment more predictable? How do I make an environment more stable? And those are issues that we really need to look at, not only in the life of the individual, but lives of families, lives of students, lives of corporate families, if you will, departments and big organizations. How do we eliminate the cumulative harm, toxic stress environments? Because the impact of not doing that just continues to promote these kinds of procedural memories, these kind of procedural processes. And remember, these were all developed because as people did them, they got a release of dopamine. They were rewarded for this. So you may say to them, well, look, that's not normal. That's like saying, you salivate when you smell cookies baking. That's not normal. You need to stop that, because we respond to our environment and we are biologically designed to do so We've got to stop vilifying people for the symptoms and start focusing on changing environments. So I hope that helps you kind of change the way you look at this stuff a little bit, the way you look at your trauma clients, in fact, the way you look at all of your clients, because I think it's essential for us to be able to free ourselves from the belief system that is driving the mental health system, driving education, driving public policy, which is all about people are broken, people are damaged. We've got to, and if people would just get their crap together, then we would all be good. And that's just not true. So remember, everything that they're doing is generating dopamine cascades which reinforce their behavior. Is this a choice? Did they choose to do this? It is not a choice. They did not wake up one morning and say, hey, I want to do this. I want to be this way. This is in response to the environments that they're in. Once we understand this much of the biology, we're really ready to talk about motivation in more detail, which, I've done some talk about motivation in different courses, and I'm going to let you kind of sit with this right now. Hopefully this addressed it. But again, my call to action with this is start thinking about how the environment needs to change rather than seeing a defect in the person that you're working with. Because essentially what you're doing is you have a vulnerable person that has all of these reactions based on their history in toxic stress or cumulative harm environments. And you are essentially judging them, criticizing them, labeling them, making them ill for having these responses, and you're wanting them not to engage in those responses anymore. But essentially what you're doing is your view of that is oppressing an already vulnerable population. And it lacks compassion. It lacks empathy. It needs to change drastically. Thank you so much. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.